everybody. It was great to see you in the next class. First thing I wanted to say is that we enabled live transcripts. We could not find a way to do closed captioning because you need to submit the transcript before, but you, yes, I'm getting some notifications. Feel free to enable it on your side. There's a button there that will let you see the words at the bottom if that's helpful to you. Okay, so just so that you know, the live cap transcript button, there's an option there that says show subtitles, and you can either enable that or disable that if you find that distracting. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to do actually is invite us to take a collective breath in and take a collective breath out. Okay, that was important for me, at least. You have actively chosen to take this class with a woman of color, and I think that's really powerful because there's a lot of DEI classes out there right now, and to take it from a person who has both the professional experience and personal experience is going to enrich your learnings. And we're going to learn about intersectionality today, coined by a brilliant woman by the name of Kimberly Crenshaw. Kimberly Crenshaw has a quote that says, "You can't change outcomes without understanding how they come about." Last class, we spoke about burnout, and I think it's really important to hold this reality in a place where we have empathy for it. One thing that I will promise you is I will not dehumanize this work. I will not take people out of the center of this journey. There are some people that may give you the frameworks and the models and the best practices, but my personal approach is to center people and center community at the center of this work. That being said, I am going to tweak the learning a little bit to maximize our time together. One thing that you'll notice is that there will be a lot more polls in this conversation, which will give us a chance to hear from everybody. I also want to say that some of the books that I recommended, none of them have personal endorsements. So that was a piece of feedback that I got, that somebody was wondering if it was a book a friend had written. It is not. So please know that anything that I recommend to you is something that I'm familiar with. It's either a colleague that's written it or somebody within the DEI space, and I invite you to check it out if you'd like, but don't feel any pressure to buy the book. Often a lot of them are available at the library. Lastly, if you do want to offer feedback, I ask that it's framed in the context of solutions as to what works better for you. That helps all DEI practitioners, including yourself, improve. So I do not tolerate any racism, any name calling, any finger pointing. It's really important to call out what may not work or what does work, and then frame it along with a solution. Finally, the Discord channel is an opportunity for us to share some of the perhaps learnings or resources or questions that we may not have time to ask in this class. There's over 50 of us, so there are a lot of people that want to ask things, and I want to make sure that I give that time to everybody. Okay, so we're going to start with a poll. Before that, I just wanted to say that some of us celebrated Nowruz yesterday and today. It's the beginning of a new year for a lot of people that are Parsi, Persian, and Ismaili, which is my husband's side of the family. The Crown Act was passed, and yesterday was World Down Syndrome Day. So just having an awareness of some of these days and holidays is really important as we do this work. And I'm going to start off with a poll right here. So if you can just answer it, it's how did you feel after the last class? So I give you the option to click multiple choices here. One of them is more structure, more discussion, more resources, more instructor expertise, or you were good with the flow. So I'll end that in about 5 seconds. Okay. So there are our responses. This is a really great practice that I encourage you to do, is polls. It's a chance to hear from everybody. As you see, there were 41 a chance there's going to be more polls, but it gives me an idea of what we need more of. So I see here, a little bit of everything. So more discussion, more resources, more instructor expertise, but definitely more structure. And some people say they're good with the flow. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward. Okay, so we are talking today about intersectionality. I have another quick poll for you. This question is really asking if you're familiar with the term intersectionality. So our options here are yes, no, a little, but I'd like to learn more. Okay. Interesting. So I'm going to share the results of this poll. Okay, so you can see here that a lot of people are familiar with the term intersectionality. There are some that aren't, and there's some that know a little but want to learn more. So we're going to talk about that today. But it's a good opportunity to remember that we can learn from each other. And so let's definitely use the Discord channel after this session to ask each other for resources and what landed well with some and others so that we continue to maximize our learning. Okay, so DEI values. Last time I actually adjusted these. These were how initially in our first session, this was how to engage. And I've changed it to DEI values. This to me is our guiding principles. And as you do this work, I encourage you to think about your DEI values. We already went over this last time, so no need to go over it again, but you'll see that I shifted the title at the top from something that's a little bit more ambiguous, like how to engage, that can mean different things for different people, to actual DEI values that guide our work. And the second change I made was to create house rules. And what I've done here is to find a way to make sure that people engage so that we maximize our time together. So we have here, mute your mic when you're not speaking so we don't have an echo. Use the hand function when needed. Remember to be respectful and kind. And you see this one is intentionally in the middle, so our eyes are drawn to it. This is really important to me personally, is remembering that we're all on a journey together and that we want to make sure that we're being kind to each other's mistakes or their decisions or their choices, remembering that we're vulnerable, right? We're human. Listen when others are talking, and then finally staying focused and avoiding multitasking. The other change I made was to create house questions. And this is really designed to get you to think about this work. So on either end, I have who is in the conversation, who is not in the conversation, and then in the middle, how can we be more inclusive? So I have in real life practices for these, but I did want to follow up with another poll. So do these house questions get you thinking about others? And you can see here, I gave an option to also, I have another suggestion. So if you have another suggestion, we can talk about that as well. Okay, so you can see these numbers here. 36 out of 42 people said yes. And what this shows you is that in DEI work, we can offer resources, we can offer frameworks, we can offer research studies, but sometimes one of the most effective things we can do is to ask a question. All of us respond to questions. And there's somebody, I don't remember who, but there's a quote out there that sometimes what sparks change is just us asking ourselves a question. So as you do this work, frame it around questions and leave it open for interpretation. So these are going to be our house questions. Now I want to follow up with a couple in real life practices. Number one is the power of three. So when you create criteria around DEI, try not to overwhelm your audience, right? We all think differently. We have different communication styles. We have different cultural styles. We have different, some of us are inward processors, some of us are outward processors, some of us are a combination of both. But 3 is a magic number to get people to think. Another best practice is to send out your content before and after, because it gives people time to review it. So when they see it, it's not their first time seeing it. I'm giving this advice to a lot of managers and people within organizations. Is your meeting can start before by you sharing your deck, and your meeting can continue onward by sharing your materials. And finally, this is a practice I saw shared at Amazon that's really powerful, and that's asking leaders or those with the most seniority to speak last. So if you're in a group and you have, someone like a CEO or a director or a manager, tell them that their role is to model active listening. And so if they speak last, then they are both modeling that behavior, but they're also giving themselves a chance to listen to others. So I would definitely advise you to try to use some of those practices and see how it turns out. Okay. So today's agenda, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to talk about intersectionality and why it's important. We're going to go over something called the Wheel of Power and Privilege, and then we're going to look at the diversity iceberg. In our last class, we were getting to know each other. There's going to be moments when it's awkward, and I think that's fine. That's part of this work. Again, we're humans. We're coming with different histories, different contexts, coming from different organizations. And part of this practice is, finding that groove as a collective. Some of us may be feeling like, whoa, I didn't know some of the stuff you're sharing. Some of us may be bored, but we can replace all of this by a curiosity. Every time I do this work, I learn something new. And before we go further, we're going to do a really quick icebreaker. I don't know if you know, but icebreakers increase people's participation, specifically their empathy and their engagement, by 80%. There's some really overused icebreakers out there, but if you introduce an icebreaker that's relevant to your topic, it can be a really great way to get to know people a little bit better. So I'm going to drop in one right here. If you could have it your way, how would you want others to introduce you at work? So we have number 1, something professional, number 2, something personal, or number 3, a combination of both. So usually while you're filling this in, usually with icebreakers, there's popcorn style where everybody says one word, but there's a lot of us on this call, so I wanted to make sure I gave an icebreaker where people could engage without, some of us speaking and some of us not. Okay, so we have a combination of both, and some people said something professional. So that's really interesting to me as a DEI professional to see that. And some of us want to keep our personal side a little bit to ourselves. So let's remember that as we, introduce each other, ask people what they're comfortable with. Okay, so we did this last time. It was our land acknowledgement. Let me stop sharing this poll. Yeah, okay. The land acknowledgement. Okay. Yesterday, I was in a meeting where somebody from the Indigenous community spoke about land acknowledgements. And they left me with 3 points that I wanted to share with you. Number 1, when you do a land acknowledgement, it's really helpful, or it's appreciated by the Indigenous community if we follow up with a call to action, right? We don't just want to ask people, what land are you on? What stolen land are you on? But actually ask them for something. And one of the things that we can ask people for, in my case, I said, the group that designed this map, nativeland.ca, is works on a volunteer basis. So we want to try to offer them donations. The second thing that the Indigenous person giving the presentation said was that Indigenous people are in the present. So we have a tendency to talk about them as if they're in the past. And we have a tendency to romanticize um, their their presence in our society. Let's stop doing that. They're here and now. They're here, they're in the here and now. So we want to make sure we respectfully engage with them that way. And the third thing is to do this work with intentionality. So again, let's not remove the people out of this work. Let's not remove the communities out of this work. Let's actually center them in the work that we do. So with that, I have another poll, and this one is about this resource. Do you understand the value of the land acknowledgement in DEI work? So we have three options here: yes, no, and I would like to take it a step further. Okay, interesting results coming in. Okay, so I'm sharing that with you here. Some people said yes, but a lot of people also said I want to take it a step further. There's also about 6 people that don't know why. The reason we do land acknowledgements is because as we do DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, it's important to acknowledge the role that we play as well. We're not just here to come in with a savior complex and save others. We're also complicit in systems of oppression. And that means understanding that the land we're on is borrowed and stolen land. For a long time, I would refer to Indigenous people as people. It's actually persons because there's different groups. And we refer to them differently in the US and in Canada. In Canada, we refer to them as First Nations. There's also the Métis community and Aboriginals. So I think it's important to remember that though there are Indigenous people around or persons around the world, the way that we speak to them should be in a way that they're comfortable with. So hopefully we will dive a little bit deeper into this with time, but I do want you to expect this slide to continue to come up, and I'm going to continue to ask questions so that we start thinking about it as more than just a checkbox activity or a checkbox slide. We're doing something with it so that we're putting our work into practice. Okay. So, review of the last class. All right, so we did a couple things in the last class. I wanted to quickly go over definitions with you. Diversity means a range of differences. We essentially have diversity in this session. There's some people from Canada, some people from the US, different ages, different races, different genders. This is diversity. Inclusion is what we do with those differences. So it's a feeling of belonging. It's a feeling of feeling like you can be your authentic self. There's a wonderful practitioner by the name of Jodi Anbury who does a TED Talk on how you actually shouldn't bring your authentic self to work. So there's different thoughts, schools of thoughts on this. Maybe our goal isn't for everybody to bring their whole selves to work. But what we don't want is for some people to dominate this space and others to feel like they have no place in our workplaces. So that's inclusion. Equity is a practice of fairness and justice. It is not the same practices for everybody. It's actually different practices for different folks, taking into account that we all start at a different place. A good way, a good analogy is to think of it as a racetrack. There's a lot of images online, and we all start at a different place, yes, depending on our privileges, our disadvantages, but there's also obstacles along the way. So if we're gonna, it's a good way to think of it as like parenting, right? Some people think if you're a parent, you may be able to relate to this, but some people think that you only need time off when you're having your children or you're having your child. No, you need continued understanding of your responsibilities if your child gets sick or somebody within the community is asking for you to take care of their child, or You may be part of something called a sandwich generation, where you're taking care of people that are younger than you and people that are older than you. A lot of people from communities around the world fall into this space. So those are the three differences. Generally in DEI, we strive for equity and not equality. So different policies and practices for different folks. We went over 2020 to 2021, which were the critical years of DEI. I want to share with you, because we talked about this briefly in the office hours. If you are looking to convince your organization of the value of this work, look for research that was done in this space. Sorry, in these years. There was an upsurge in work during this time. So you could look as far back as the 1960s, 70s civil rights movement. There's so many pieces you can pull on. But if you want to pull on data that's recent, I would start with these years and then add on to it some additional pieces that make the point to your organization. And finally, differences in various parts of the world. As I told you, my expertise is in global DEI, remembering that 4.2% of the world's population is in the US. So as we think, let's continue to think about what this looks like outside the US. I say this because, as our organizations grow, as our workplaces evolve and change, we want to make sure we're being inclusive of people in different parts of the world. There's something really, a great practice called the follow the sun model. Yes, I saw in the chat. Can you repeat that percentage? It's 4.25%. So between 4 and 5% of the world's population is in the US. So the follow the sun model, if you have a global team or you have anybody on your organization, some of you may be part of nonprofits, and you want to be inclusive of people around the world, there's a great practice called follow the sun. And what that means is that you change your meeting times so that they're inclusive of people that are, perhaps not East Coast, Eastern Standard Time, Western Standard Time, but perhaps calling in from different parts of the world. So that's something you may want to look into if that is the nature of your organization. Okay, so poll number 8. Which one of these topics did you find most relevant to class 1? I would love to get a pulse from you. A lot of us DEI practitioners call these pulses because it gives us an idea of where your interests are, where perhaps your interests are not, and then to continuously evolve our content around that. And I want to just thank you for taking part in these polls. This is really helpful to me personally, and hopefully to each other, to see and learn more about one another. Okay. So we have here definitions, differences, and examples. This is great. A lot of you gave this answer. This is the foundational work. Some of you were interested in all, and then there were a couple of you that were interested in the other areas. If some of this work is, you're feeling like, you know it, you want to be challenged a little bit more, do message me and I'll make sure that I give you some added content or some added perspectives that can, shift and move your understanding to a place that's more beneficial to you. Okay, so we're going to go into intersectionality. Some of you may have seen an image that's circulated, and it looks like a number of different identities as floating clouds. So you have age, religion, gender, ethnicity, race. That is, and they're all sort of different shapes and sizes. I would challenge us to think a little bit more deeply as to what intersectionality is. And the best way to do that is to go to the person who coined the term, and that's Kimberly Crenshaw. I don't know if all of you got a chance to listen to her YouTube video. If you didn't, it's about 2 to 3 minutes. I would highly recommend it, almost to the point when it's absolutely mandatory, because nobody can explain the term better than the person who actually came up with it. Unfortunately, in DEI, we've seen a lot of people lean into explaining this concept without giving credit to Kimberly Crenshaw herself, and I don't support that. I think we need to give credit where credit is due. So, in her own words, intersectionality is the complex ways in which multiple forms of discrimination, so for example, racism, sexism, classism, combine in the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups. Kimberly Crenshaw is a professor at Columbia Law and UCLA. I've added her Twitter handle here. She also has a podcast called Intersectionality Matters, which I definitely encourage you to check out, because again, no better person than to teach us about this topic than Kimberly herself. So a couple things I wanted to tell you. Intersectionality began from the discrimination that Black women or Black girls felt. So though we talk about it as, how different identities compound, it is framed, and it was framed initially in the context of Black women, and I want to give credit to that. Also, it's not a theory, it's a prism. So when we think of a prism, it's a lens, right? Theories in a lot of ways are different because they're changing. A prism is a way to look at something. Also, one thing that Kimberly says is it's the way that disadvantages compound. So they don't just, come together. They actually, one comes over the other. And that's a really important piece to remember. And I love what Kimberly says here. She says intersectionality and our identities, they're not a self-contained unit. It's a relationship. It's a relationship between people and history, communities, and institutions, right? So when we start thinking about it that way, we understand that this work is framed around people. One in real life practice that I wanted to share with you, if you're doing DEI work within an organization, it's important to do two things. Number one, we want to remove barriers, right? So an example of a barrier could be hiring bias, right? Some of us may not feel like they're getting the right opportunity to apply for a job because you're vetted out because of your title, right? You may say, I was never a director, or I was never, a manager, but you're hiring for a manager role. Or our names, right? Some of us have names that some people may consider hard to pronounce. Some of us may have credentials that are foreign that some employees may not recognize. Some of us may not have visas to work in the countries we're working in. So you want to remove barriers. At the same time, you want to do the second thing, and that's creating opportunities, right? If you do one, if you remove barriers, but you don't create opportunities, or you create opportunities and you don't remove barriers, you're not really doing the work properly. So I definitely encourage you to think of it as like a gear shift where you're doing both at the same time. One way that DEI practitioners refer to it as building while you fly, right? You want to be able to do two things at the same time. Yes, I see in the chat. Can you repeat a relationship between people? So that's kind of like the main component. And then the three areas that Kimberly Crenshaw says intersectionality is based on is number one, institutions, history, and communities. Okay. So this is a slide that explains intersectionality. Again, you can see it's not just floating identities, it's an actual line that goes through gender and race. And I'll explain this a little bit more as we get into the further slides, but I really wanted to share this with you so that we are all aligned on what intersectionality means. We all have heard about the feminist movement. We're in the fourth wave right now, but there's been a lot of feedback that feminism that's not intersectional is actually not feminism. Feminism, for those of you that don't know, is just women having choice, right? So they may take the choice to be a stay-at-home mother or to work or to not work, but the choice is theirs. But this is an example of a movement in history that is not often focused on women at the intersections, so gender and race, and we are around an opportunity where we can do both. I do want to challenge you to also think about what intersectionality looks like globally. Do immigrants have different experiences than people who are naturalized? One example is when you come, some immigrants that come to the US or Canada are brought in on the criteria that they're educated. So that is formally educated, so they have a formal degree of some sort. Um, Otherwise, they would not achieve that immigration. So that, in a lot of ways, may give us a privilege to those who perhaps were brought here through enslavement or other reasons. Perhaps they were brought against their will, and I think that's something to definitely keep in mind as we do this work. Okay, so I want to thank everybody for participating in the chat. Thank you for sharing. Queerness, faith is important in the foundation of intersectionality as well. Yes, absolutely. We definitely have to talk about queerness and also the violence against trans folk, how that impacts Black trans people as well. I really appreciate you sharing this, and for those of you who are also, thinking about other examples. Um, Sorry, let me just move the chat so that I see it. Should queer, neurodiversity, and class and other identities not be captured in this graphic? Mel, that's a great question. So some of the resources we come across as a facilitator, I really encourage us to think about how we can shift and create our own, because we all have the opportunity to create something new from what we've seen, and that's how this field continues to evolve. So I'm going to write this down and think about how we can create an intersectionality model or graph that is more inclusive of different identities. So thank you for that. Okay, I also see skin color mentioned here. Yes, I don't know if those of you had a chance to look through the tip sheet, but last class we spoke about some identities, and some of the ones we mentioned that aren't often mentioned are colorism. Colorism is the advantage given to people who have lighter skin tones than darker skin tones. Anti-Blackness is global, so with that comes a degree of privilege for people who are lighter skinned, and we want to make sure that we're inclusive of that. Neurodiversity, yes, absolutely, we should be including that. In fact, I would say that this is a piece that we are only talking about at a mainstream level now, and we need to give that justice and not leave that on the back burner like we have for as long as we have. And for those of you that don't know, neurodiversity refers to atypical ways of communicating and how our brains function. Okay. So this next slide is an important one that explains intersectionality. What does this look like in practice? What we have here is a slide from Equal Pay Back Project, and it shows us the differences between the earnings of white men and then Hispanic women. We don't have Indigenous women on here. We don't have Asian women on here. We don't have added intersections, so it is in no way complete, in my opinion. Though it is a good starting point to this conversation. I have included the link here if you want to learn more. I would definitely bookmark this this website. The reason is because every year it tells you what the equal pay day is for every race. So March 17th or 18th was equal pay day for women, but that's not all women, right? The equal pay day for Black women, for Latina women, for Indigenous women is different. And what it means is how many days it takes for us to catch up to the earning potential of a white man for work of equal value. Okay. So I wanted to give you a couple in real life best practices. Number one, if you're part of an organization, I would encourage you to suggest disaggregated data. So I'm going to actually write that in the chat so that you get that. Okay. Disaggregated data refers to data that's broken down by different groups. So if we're going to look at pay equity, what is it similar to this graphic, right? What is it that what are white men being paid at the organization? What are white women being paid, and so on and so forth? But don't stop there, right? What are people with disabilities being paid? What level are they at? What is their promotional rate? How many of them are on the board? If we only look at data as men and women, that's not a complete picture of what's actually going on. Okay. Another thing is promotional reviews. Oh my goodness. Okay. One of the most effective things we can do is take out subjectivity from promotional reviews. So if you're in an organization and somebody says, I'm ready to promote Monique because Monique looks like a leader. I'm ready to promote Farah because Farah, I trust this person to do the work. I'm ready to promote Sadia because this person has led exciting projects. That's not a reason, that's too subjective. It really we end up landing on who we like and often who we're comfortable with, right? So instead, try to lean more into objective promotional reviews. Let's look at what this person was able to accomplish with the resources that they have, right? So if your resources are a budget of 5,000, what were you able to do with that? Okay, Farah, from your example in the office hours, you said that you led a DEI council. If you can do that with a $5,000 budget, you should be promoted. So suggesting that we develop our promotional reviews off objective criteria instead of subjective, and words that are like somebody looks like somebody, somebody acts like somebody seems like they're doing something, is a really effective way to bring equity into our organizations. Another piece is to be transparent. Like, we deserve transparency around pay data. For those of us in the US, we have the EEO, which is public. We have census data. All of this gives us insights into where the representation is within an organization. And you can go to HR or whatever different department in your organization and ask them. And you can also challenge them. I challenged my organization because I found that Asians in the US are grouped under one lump identity. But there's an amazing graphic that shows that East Asian men have a incredibly different pay grade than Southeast Asian women. Like, it's almost double or triple. So when we lump people together, we have an opportunity to evolve that work. Okay. So, Jillery, I see your hand up. Do you mind if we take that question to the Q&A portion? And
no problem.
Sorry?
No problem. That's fine.
Thank you. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is a really powerful quote by Audre Lorde. There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. When you are giving, if you're trying to convince your leadership, if you notice in this presentation, I'm not just showing you data, I'm showing you graphics. And I'm also bringing in quotes. Quotes are a really powerful way to influence people, especially when they come from people that are respected around the world. So here's a great quote, but you can look up any quotes and build them into your presentation and your argument as you look for support and resources. So I have here in my notes that in real life, when we collect data, I definitely encourage you to try to collect data around 2 or more identities. Start with the glaring gaps within your organization, right? Sometimes you can see it, sometimes you can't see it. But some examples may be race and gender and level, right? Another example is accessibility or disability and level, right? Another example could be age and hiring, right? Coming from the tech industry, there's definitely a privilege to being younger. I think there's a term for people that are older in the tech industry. It's uh, not a positive term at all, but you can see where the gaps are, right? Try to collect data by trans people within your organization and their safety. Are they reporting safety um, concerns more than other groups? Race and attrition. Attrition is the rate at which people leave an organization. Are people of a certain race leaving more often than others? Parents, non-parents, caregivers, that's another one. Um, Ex-military and non-military, or veterinarians and non-veterinarians, people that are inside the US and people that are outside the US. So there's a number of different ways we can collect this data, but all of the examples I shared are two or more identities. They're not just gender, they're not just race, they're not just level, they are capturing where the gaps are. Okay, so we are at understanding power and privilege. This is, I don't know if you all have seen this poll before. I am going to give you a second to look through it, and then if you don't mind filling in this poll right here. Hey, very, very, very interesting.
Were you going to show us the screen first with the?
Oh, I'm sorry. Does the poll interfere with the screen? Is it coming up on your slide?
Yeah. Okay, now it is. Yes.
Okay.
Oh, it's a little small.
It's a little small.
It might be my screen, but it is a little small.
If you just kind of make this work on the screen on your, you could make it look bigger.
If you stop share for a moment, it will. Oh wait, never mind. It won't go bigger.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's big on my screen. I will certainly share this with you.
If you go to share screen advanced options, you can specifically put a box around what you want to be shown. So you can put the box around the wheel of privilege, and it will only show that. It'll cut out everything else.
Okay. I'm gonna try to do that. I have a couple screens open, so I apologize if I'm not able to do that. I will certainly share this with you in detail afterwards. Apologies, I'm still trying to figure out how to make sure I manage the different screens. So let me do that. But in the meantime, I'm going to share the poll results with you. Some people said yes, some people said no, and some people said they need more time to think about it. So coming from the perspective of, this is a lot of content coming at you. I will share that with you as well. Okay, so let me see if I can. Yeah, that's advanced portion of the screen. Okay, I think I got this. No, I'm sorry, that's not. Are you able to see that clear? Is that a little bit?
Yes, it's locked.
Okay, great. Great. So this is the Wheel of Power and Privilege. There's different versions of it. This one was created by a person in Canada, Sylvia Duckworth. But what it is a wheel that shows us that we all hold some degree of privilege. I actually wrote an article recently about privilege and how it's a spectrum and not a switch. So we're not either privileged or not privileged. It depends on the privileges that we're talking about. The fact that we all have access to computers and technology right now means we have a degree of privilege. And I would love for you to go back and think about this and also share this with your leaders, because it's an opportunity to bring them into conversation. There's a wonderful quote by Bell Hooks that says, "Privilege is not in and of itself bad. What matters is what we do with that privilege." And I want you to hold on to that, because that's something that brings us all into this conversation. Sorry about that. Okay. I'm not sure how to end this. I wasn't sure how to end that portion, so let me just. Okay, hopefully you can see that whole screen now. But this is a screen this is the diversity iceberg that was part of our agenda. Again, there's different versions of this, but what it's meant to show you is that some identities are visible or apparent to us, and some of us are invisible or inapparent to us. We don't know everything about everyone right away. Some examples are pronouns, right? When I first began this work, I would tell everyone, share your pronouns, share your pronouns. Not everybody feels like they may want to share their pronouns. Some of us may be in a position of transitioning from one gender to the other. Some of us may feel like they're in a work environment where they are not in a safe place to share. The point is that there are always going to be some things that we don't know about, and I think this is an important way to remember where identities lie. So I have a quick poll for you here. Did you personally learn about any identities using this iceberg? Okay. So some people learned something, some people did not. I appreciate the bottom question, which is do we need something more complex? Sometimes when I look at this, I think that we have an opportunity to create or share something that is not just above the watermark, below the watermark, but something that really captures maybe what society places emphasis on, right? Or where the conversations are happening today versus more holistically. Okay, so another great quote by Kimberly Crenshaw: "If we aren't intersectional, some of us, the most marginal, are going to fall through the cracks." We briefly touched on this on the last session, and it's the idea that we're not all starting at an equal starting point. So really what we want to do is create programs and policies and solutions for people at the margins, wherever that is, whoever that is, and then essentially that creates solutions for everybody. But if we're only creating it for the people that are that are not intersectional but only represented in one area, then we're not really doing full justice to this work. So this takes us to our exercise. We didn't have time to do this last time as we were getting to know each other, but I want to make sure we do that workshop before we end that class, before we end this course. So maybe we'll do it in the next class or the class after. But what we have here are, I'm going to put you in groups, and at 6:30 we end for Q&A. So this is a chance for you to talk to each other. I'm going to do 10 groups with about 5 people. This is the situation. If any of you are familiar with ADA, I've worked with ADA. They're a wonderful organization. The description is ADA Developers Academy, which develops access and opportunities for young women of color in tech. Started as an organization that helps young girls become coders. In its early stages, the CEO collected info on gender, but not race, and many Black and brown girls felt like they were left out of access and opportunities in tech. So what I would like you to do is to think about that diversity iceberg and how we can take a more intersectional approach to representing marginalized communities in the workplace. I don't know if we'll have time for the larger discussion. I will share some in real life takeaways in the upcoming tip sheet for this week, for this session. Sorry, we have 2 classes this week. But I want you to start, have a conversation around this because it's really applicable to our workplaces today. How do we make sure we don't fall into this situation where we're only looking at one identity and not many? And I do want to say, don't feel like you need to limit yourself to race and gender. In fact, that's one of the takeaways at the end of this, that DEI is not just about race and gender, it is about different identities. So I will put you into breakout rooms now. You don't need to do anything. I will do everything on my side, and we will come back in about 10 minutes. Okay, everybody, welcome back. I will be asking you all whether you liked this exercise and whether you would, because we have a case study for every class, whether you would like to spend more time on these and less time elsewhere, and then we'll continue to evolve. What I'm going to ask is that if you had in real life practice that you came up with as to how to be inclusive of people with intersectional identities, please share it in the Discord channel, because that's going to be a chance for us to read other people's ideas and then think about it. The one suggestion I would definitely give is to ask leadership to collect data by 2 or more identities. That's one of the most effective ways I think that we can be inclusive of different intersectional identities in the workplace. Okay, so assignment number 2 is an optional assignment, just like assignment number 1. You will be given a case study of an organization that made a DEI blunder, answer the questions, and develop an understanding of how intersectionality can be measured in the workplace. The case study it's International Women's Day, and Acme, if you grew up in the 80s like myself, then Acme was just what the cartoons would call all the companies. But they decided to host a panel called Women in Tech. They reach out to their networks and gather 5 speakers. When they share their live conversation on social media, followers start commenting about how they are all white, all from the US, and all part of the C-suite, and this isn't a diverse representation. What went wrong? And then the 3 questions I had are, what are the single identities that organizations usually focus on? What are the multiple identities that organizations usually overlook? And how would you commit to intersectionality in day-to-day operations? Remember, as a writer, I'll tell you, less is sometimes more. So please, I would love to read your answers if you're going to do this assignment. But there's 1 of me and there's 50 of you, and we meet in 2 days. So do share maybe 1 answer to the question, or if you choose to do 3, try to make it succinct. I would really appreciate that. Okay, so we're at the Q&A portion. For the office hours, Jillery had a question that we didn't get to, and I'm sure you do, others do as well. Jillery, your question was about assessing the learning journey, and I wanted to answer that. If you're within an organization and you want to assess where people are in their learning journey, to date, as far as I know, and I want to preface this by saying I do not know everything, so if you know otherwise, please share. There is no single-handed way to assess where people are in the DEI journey. However, there is a framework called SELF. SELF stands for self-awareness, education, leading, and facilitating. It's actually a facilitation framework. And if you create a survey around self, you can ask people where they think they are in their journey of DEI. You may find a lot of people are in the self-awareness phase, or they're trying to, learn, and they're getting into the education, the resources, but they're not in a place of leading or facilitating, which is probably the highest place of, you teach what you know. So that may be one way to assess people's learning journey, is the self framework. And then again, if anyone has any other suggestions, please feel free to drop it either in the chat or in the Discord channel. And that leaves the Q&A portion open to others if you want to ask questions. Veronica, I saw your name up. Sorry, your hand up.
Oh, it was just to add to the conversation about assessments, but I can just drop it in the chat if there are other hands raised. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that.
Dia, someone asked during the presentation, did you have a template or framework for, and please, whoever asked, I think it was Christian, but I don't remember, for promotions, something to that matter, a template or framework you could suggest to us?
Do you mean like a promotional review format?
Yes, promotional review.
Yeah, I do have a framework on equitable promotional criteria, so I will definitely share that following the class, because there's a ton of promotional frameworks out there, but they're not all equitable. So if we have one that's equitable, then that's
thank you.
So of course, Chantal, thank you for asking. Nina, you had your hand up.
Hi, this is slightly related to the assessment of the learning process, but I'm interested in how do you assess where people's emotional states are in talking about this? Because it's like, you know, one word or one phrase or a concept can throw somebody off, and all of a sudden what they thought was a safe place is no longer that for them.
Oh, Nina, I'm so glad you asked this question. In our first class, we talked about, you know, the 15 characteristics of white supremacy, and I think one of them is that it's an either or dynamic where people are either okay or they're not okay, when the reality is there's some days when we feel better and some days when we feel worse, often affected by what happens in the outside world. So I don't think there's any one way to measure it. I think that the more of a trusting environment we create, the more people can be open. I highly recommend confidential surveys, because it gives people an opportunity to be honest about how they're feeling without fearing retaliation. So I think that's a really effective way to get a pulse on how people are feeling. I think it's really important to ask people how they're feeling today as well, because that can change, and nobody wants to be labeled as somebody who's always, you know, pitied, right? So I don't know if that gives a one way of doing this, but I do think that we should continuously assess how people are feeling and do it in a way that understands that it's always changing and evolving. Okay, I want to make sure.
Could I say something? Sorry, I'm driving. I can't raise my hand.
I actually don't know who's talking, so forgive me for that. I think it's Jen.
Is
that you?
Yep, the best, Jen Fry. Yeah. So just a few things when we talk about surveys. When you're surveying stuff, you want to make sure you use a Likert scale and not a yes/no. Yes/no is not going to give you the data you want. Also, you don't want to use a ton of open-ended questions that can really screw up your data. You want to use closed-ended, very few open-ended. And then the next thing is you really want to distinguish between anonymous and confidential. You want to explain confidential means we're going to know whose information it is, but we're not going to do X, Y, Z with it. Anonymous means we have no clue whose information it is. And you want to be very specific about the method you use to survey, as if the method used to survey can get you anonymous or confidential, because it can show you the IP or it can't.
Jen, thank you so much. These are wonderful, wonderful points. As we talk about surveying, there's some of you that are absolute experts on this. Jen, you've definitely, shown your expertise. So I would encourage you to, Jen, if you don't mind, reach out to Jen. And Jen, if you can share any added resources on the Discord channel, I think this is a wonderful opportunity to not just develop surveys, but develop surveys that are effective. This is a learning moment for me too, that just anonymous surveys is not enough, because then we're not really seeing where the gaps lie. So I appreciate you sharing that. Jillery and Luce, I see your hands up. I want to definitely get to you. I just want to end with a couple slides here very quickly. Number one, the bottom line, this is a slide I share in all my sessions. We had this in the last session. DEI is about more more than gender or race. When we create solutions for the margins, we create solutions for everybody. So there's a reason why we do this. It's not because we're favoring one group over the other. There's a methodology. There's a reason behind why we do what we do in DEI. We look at the people at the margins and we really try to create solutions for them. For example, if we create all gendered bathrooms in some cases, and I have to remember if bathrooms is a Canadian word. Being in the US, I always get that mixed up. But we essentially can create that for everybody, right? If we create accessibility in workplaces, we're creating that for everybody. DEI work is rooted in understanding ourselves and understanding others. So it's not just about understanding others. It's not just understanding about ourselves. It's about understanding the whole picture. And from the perspective of somebody with a background in education, remember we have different learning styles, right? We don't all learn the same way. So when we do this work, it doesn't only have to be through writing. It can be through interactive activities like breakout rooms or through visuals. There's a number of different ways that we can do that. Finally, some resources. The first one is the article I wrote. It's very short. To support DEI, understand privilege. This really made its rounds around different organizations. It was about 2 years ago when people weren't really talking that much, or three years ago when people weren't really talking about privilege associated with DEI. Black Cancer is a podcast by, again, a woman that I mentioned previously, Jodi Anbury. She speaks about her lived experiences of a Black woman having cancer. What really stood out to me is that she said as a Black woman, she felt invisible. And then as a Black woman with cancer, she finally felt visible. And that was something I would have never learned about if I hadn't learned about it in her words. So it's an example of an intersectional resource that shows us that our learnings are rooted in not just learning about people through their individual identities. Finally, a book, Inclusion on Purpose, an intersectional approach to creating a culture of belonging at work, interviews a number of women in the workplace about their experiences, and then what we have before next class. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we have 4 hands raised. So Nina, I don't know if yours was from something I had already answered. Jillery, I do want to come back to you, and Luz, I do want to come back to you. Farah, we haven't heard your question yet in this session. Did you want to ask, and then I'll go to Luz after that, and then back to Jillery if we still have time.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. My question is, we talked a lot about surveying and focus groups today, and I'm really wanting to do that swiftly. And one of the challenges I face is that within my organization, there is not a lot of racial diversity or what I would consider visible diversity. And so when you look at some of our inclusion surveys, levels of inclusion or feelings of inclusion are quite high, which, is pretty common when you have a really homogenous groups. And so my question is, how can I connect with the individuals who may not be feeling, that sense of belonging without targeting them, openly, just by visibly knowing some of the people who are from underrepresented or historically marginalized groups? Or any best practice or recommendation?
Yeah, I think you can invite people to voluntarily participate. And in your email or mode of communication, you can say that you want to be able to get an idea of how people are feeling within the workplace of various identities or intersecting identities, so that you're not calling out anyone in particular, but you're definitely saying, right now we may have a homogenous perspective and we want to broaden our perspective. So words like this really invite people to share their their experiences, again, in a safe way. If you want to learn more about psychological safety, I would read Amy Edmondson. She's a professor, I believe, at Harvard, who's written about this extensively, but it's a good attachment that you can put onto the email so that people can understand your approach to doing this work. So hopefully that helps. We have about 30 seconds left. Jillery and Luce, I'm going to let the rest of the class go, and then I'd love to take another 5 minutes to answer your questions. I will follow up with a couple more things in the Discord channel and the class Google Classroom, including asking you if that tip sheet was relevant or if you're feeling as if it was too many resources. I just wanted to end by saying, from my perspective, I'm learning about you all. I want to make sure that I do the best job possible, but that also involves, getting to know one another a little bit more. So I'd appreciate your grace there. And thank you for your time. Thank you for your participation. And most of all, I just want to say, burnout is real. It is real. And I'm holding space for all of you that continue to face that. We're going to continue on this work together. And I look forward to our Thursday class. Take care, everybody.
Somebody asked if they could stick around to listen to answer the question.
Yes, that's fine.
So I wanted to comment on Nina's question where she talked about, the emotions around situations. I do extensive programs and workshops around emotional intelligence. So what I found is people have hired me to come into the organization to work directly with certain people who are having a hard time comprehending certain aspects, communicating in a way that's respectful, or even gaining the ability to feel empowered to communicate. So I would like to bring it up to the group that there's a possibility also to bring in someone like me, an emotional intelligence expert, to do assessments around EQ. Because we could have self-awareness, but how are we with self-regulation? How are we in a social environment? Are we able to have empathy? So I wanted to bring that up. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Yeah, Luz, thank you so much for sharing. They say there's 3 types of intelligences: IQ, which arguably is not even an accurate way of measuring intelligence, but there is EQ, emotional intelligence, and then CQ, which is cultural intelligence. So what you're speaking to is a more holistic version of, helping others develop this. IQ, they say, is something that you have, and then EQ is CQ is something you can develop. So I just
and there is a difference between high EQ and smart EQ, because you can have high EQ, but then you're overwhelmed by all the emotions.
Yes.
How do you shift into the spectrum of how to manage that with others?
Yeah, HSPs is another acronym you may have heard of: highly sensitive people, who sometimes there's a lot of stimulus around them, and we need to be inclusive of people like that as well. So thank you for sharing. Jillery, you wanted to ask something?
I have so many questions, but I guess I want to maybe take a little bit of a step back, because one of the things that we've been reflecting on, I do a lot of work doing audits of organizations, equity audits of organizations, and have it's kind of ramped up in the past 2 years, I would say. And one of the challenges is knowing how and when an organization is not ready to engage in this work. And it always feels weird to say no. For somebody who's an organization is coming forward and saying we want to reflect, but I just wanted to know if maybe you had some best practices in understanding some pre-work that might need to happen for an organization before they're at a place where their staff or their board or whoever cultures are ready to engage any deeper in this work. I've had a recent experience where it feels like it was a show. And so we went along with the process. We wrote the report. We gave recommendations. And when the recommendations came out, they didn't like it, and have done everything they could to try to reword things, to massage language, to soften language, to omit things. And so now I'm thinking, it likely we should have said no and demanded some pre-work of you before we did all this and got people's hopes up?
Yeah, so there's a couple. Number one, there's assessments like DISC, Myers-Briggs. There's also Globe Smart, which is an excellent one, which gives people like a survey to fill out as to what their style of communication is within the workplace, and it maps everyone's together. So you start to see like what's missing. So something like that is a really good start to get the conversation going. Um, from there, and there's a number of different ones. I don't want to say we're limited to that, but from there, the big consulting companies, so Deloitte, McKinsey, um, Boston Consulting Group, have done a really good job in the past 5 years putting out reports that really capture the state importance and place of DEI right now. There's other organizations like Korn Ferry and so many catalysts that are excellent as well. I personally like the big consulting companies because they're so skilled at showing the information in charts. So, like the pay equity one I showed you, there's one that came out by McKinsey recently called Lean In, and it shows the state of women since COVID. There's another one about Black women in the workplace. So they're getting even more specific, and it's like that one report that you can share. And if you know exactly the area that you want them to focus on, you can say, look at figure 1.2, look at page 89, and it will show them, it lifts the work off you to try to explain something in a way that an expert has already explained it. So hopefully that is helpful. I am going to invite you all to come to the next office hours on Thursday. I'm going to go be with my son now. So I hope that you all are taking care of yourself, and it was just a wonderful session. So take care, rest, and mental health first.